It begins in a room so quiet you can hear the air move. No windows. Phones sealed in. Padded drawers. A wall of maps that look deceptively simple coastlines, roads, a scatter of red dots that mean reactors or airfields or places no one is supposed to say out loud. Aide passes a folder across a table. Inside are strike options. Routes, refuel points, estimated. Casualties, projected retaliation. President listens. Voices rise and fall, risk intelligence. Gaps, oil markets, troops within missile range, coalition politics, the Strait of Hormuz, war. Plans for the day after. Do we hit Natanz? Verdun? Parchin? What about the embassies, the carriers, the bases, the civilians? The president absorbs it all and asks the question every one of his predecessors has asked. What happens next? The answer is never clean. And so, for decades, through revolution and hostage crises, tanker wars and nuclear standoffs, U.S. presidents have stood up from that same table, closed the same folder, and chosen the same line. Not today. This is the story of the strike that didn't happen and why it didn't. A story told in contingency. Plans and classified war games, in cables and backchannel offers, in sanctions regimes and cyber campaigns that moved like shadows across a hard drive. It is the record of American power, measured not only by what it can destroy, but by what it decides to spare. Begin where restraint first learned its shape. 1979. The Shah is gone. The Islamic Revolution roars through Iran, and an embassy in Tehran becomes a prison for American diplomats. In Washington, anger hardens into options. Sanctions. A rescue mission. Quiet talk deep inside the Pentagon about how you might break an adversary's will if you had to. But the old language of punishment, bomb their oil, hit their airfields, collides with a new reality. Iran is not a remote outpost. It is a nation of tens of millions with a coastline that touches the jugular of the global economy. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow throat through which much of the world's oil passes on fragile hulls. Close it even for a week and the price. Shocks radiate in hours. President Carter authorizes Operation Eagle Claw, a surgical rescue in the night. It ends in dust and wreckage in the Iranian desert. No bombers fly to Tehran. The instinct hardens. The United States can break things in Iran, but it cannot predict what breaks next. The 1980s convert caution into doctrine through experience. The Iran-Iraq war turns the Gulf into a hazard zone. The United States tilts toward Iraq quietly, reflags Kuwaiti tankers, escorts convoys through waters where mines don't care who they harm. In 1988, after a mine rips open the hull of a U.S. warship, Washington answers with force. Operation Praying Mantis is swift and brutal. Iranian naval assets burn. Oil platforms used as staging posts are wrecked. It is the largest U.S. surface engagement since World War II. It is also limited. The United States does not bomb Tehran. It does not strike Iranian soil. Then a tragedy. Iran Air 655, a civilian airliner, downed by the USS Vincennes in a fog of misidentification and fear. The shock of it reinforces the logic of carefulness. War in the Gulf is not a controlled exercise. A single misread blip can become 290 lost lives in minutes. Even in the Reagan years, when American rhetoric was hawkish and its defense budgets vast, the White House draws a line. Punish what threatens the sea lanes. Avoid the open door of war with Iran. The 1990s redraw the map of American priorities. With the Soviet Union gone, the Middle East shifts under new pressures. The United States fights a short, blazing war to expel Iraq from Kuwait, then holds Saddam Hussein in a box of sanctions and no-fly zones. Iran becomes a problem to be managed rather than solved. President Clinton's team calls it dual containment. Restrain Iraq and Iran simultaneously through economic pressure and diplomatic isolation. Intelligence flags an emerging nuclear program in Iran. Equipment orders, suspect sites, yet the case for bombing is muddy. The country's facilities are dispersed, some under civilian cover, some buried. International law is a thicket. The United States leans into multilateral sanctions at the United Nations. Then, a blow, Khobar Towers, 1996. 19 U.S. airmen dead in Saudi Arabia. Investigators trace the attack to a group with ties to Iran. Inside the Situation Room, there are voices for retaliation. Clinton cautious, ops for indictment, diplomatic pressure, covert disruption. The threshold to bomb Iran.
Romain Incrost.
After September 11th, the calculus should tilt to action. President George W. Bush names Iran in the axis of evil, a phrase built for clarity. The war in Afghanistan begins. The invasion of Iraq follows. Inside the Pentagon, planners sketch what a campaign against Iran might look like. Complex, extended, dangerous. The same maps pass from hand to hand. Bushehr, Isfahan, Iraq, Natan's names that will soon become familiar on cable news. The nuclear file thickens. In 2002, an exiled group publicizes sites at Natanz and Iraq. Satellite photos make their way to newspapers and think tanks. The word enrichment enters the American vocabulary. And yet the United States does not bomb. Why? Bandwidth is one answer. Two wars have stretched logistics and patience thin. Another answer is risk. U.S. troops across Iraq sit within easy range of Iranian rockets and militias. The IRGC can bleed them with explosively formed penetrators and improvised rockets, turn supply routes into kill zones, turn a bad war worse. And a third answer, uncertainty. In 2007, a national intelligence estimate sends a shock wave through Washington by assessing that Iran halted its structured weaponization program in 2003, even as it continued to expand enrichment. The physicists could keep learning, but the political apparatus, the design, the testing frameworks had paused. The headline is confusing. The debates inside the security community are not. A war might destroy what exists and also speed up what does not yet exist. The United States presses sanctions and covert tools instead. If there is a hinge in this story, it is the decade of slow-burn pressure and quiet sabotage that follows. In this period, the decision not to bomb is not an absence. It is an alternative strategy. Under President Bush and then President Obama, a covert cyber operation reported years later as Olympic Games slips into Iranian control systems like a whisper and teaches a centrifuge to tear itself apart. Stuxnet becomes a buzzword for while then a case study. Scientists tied to the program are targeted and killed in Tehran. Street attacks widely attributed to Israel. The United States says little and allies say less.
Sanctions deepen.
Banking restrictions bite. Oil exports slump. In back rooms and hotel suites, American and Iranian negotiators begin to orbit each other, passing messages. Through Oman, building the architecture of what will become the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal of 2015. But before the deal, there is a moment of acute tension that brings the non-bombing habit into sharp relief. Between 2011 and 2012, talk of an Israeli strike dominates headlines and whispers alike. Israel weighs whether to hit Iranian facilities alone. Inside the Obama White House, the question is not theoretical. War games cycle through scenarios. If Israel strikes, does Iran retaliate against U.S. assets? Do American forces get pulled into the fight? Does the United States preemptively join to finish the job and control the ladder of escalation? The folders on the table grow heavier. Senior officials fly to Tel Aviv. Generals trade guarded sentences in secure rooms. The core case against bombing is precise and unromantic. The targets are real. Many are hard. Fordow is dug into a mountain. Natanz is large and can be rebuilt. An attack might delay the program by a year, 2, perhaps 3. But the knowledge would remain. The political space for diplomacy would collapse. Iranian hardliners would be vindicated. The program might sprint underground, without inspectors, without cameras, Without the leverage of a coalition, President Obama chooses the other path: a sanctions, vice, and a negotiating table. The 2015 deal is a bet that inspection and limits can trade time for stability. Iran ships out most of its enriched uranium stockpile, caps the purity of what remains, fills Iraq's reactor core with concrete, installs cameras, accepts intrusive oversight. Critics argue that sunsets expire and the regime remains hostile. Supporters argue that bombs can buy you years and inspectors can buy you years, and one option doesn't kill anyone today. What matters for this story is not the verdict but the choice. Again, a president looks at a target list and looks away, because the alternative seems more likely to serve U.S. interests at acceptable cost. Then the pendulum swings. In 2018, President Donald Trump withdraws the United States from the deal and launches a maximum pressure campaign.
Sanctions multiplient. Iran.
Responds with calibrated breaches enrichment resumes at higher levels, advanced. Centrifuges spin, stockpiles grow. In the Gulf, tankers are damaged. A U.S. drone is shot down. Major Saudi oil facilities at Abqaiq are struck by missiles and drones in 2019. An attack attributed to Iran that have Saudi output for days. This is the kind of move that, in another era, would invite a dramatic response. The United States does not bomb Iran. There is reporting of a plan on the president's desk limited strikes in response to the drone shoot down. He is said to have called it off at the last minute when briefers estimated civilian casualties that felt disproportionate. Instead, the United States opts for cyber retaliation. Months later, in January 2020, a U.S. drone kills Qasem Soleimani, the powerful commander of Iran's Quds force in Baghdad. It is a strike of historic audacity, one that brushes the line of direct war without crossing into Iranian soil. Tehran fires ballistic missiles at bases in Iraq that house U.S. troops. Dozens suffer traumatic brain injuries. The United States does not retaliate further. The red line: no bombing inside Iran holds. Under President Joe Biden, the pattern continues, shaped by exhaustion with long wars and fueled by fresh dangers. The administration quietly explores a return to nuclear limits while Iran advances its program beyond the old deal's fences, enriching to levels that tighten the breakout timeline if a political decision were made in Tehran to rush U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. Weather attacks from Iran-backed militias. The Pentagon answers with strikes on depots and launch sites beyond Iran's border. The region grows more combustible.
Iran.
Sends drones and missiles to partners. Israel conducts covert operations and airstrikes in Syria, and in April 2024, after a strike in Damascus kills senior IRGC figures, Iran launches an unprecedented barrage of drones and missiles at Israel, most intercepted with U.S. help. Even then, as calls for escalation echo, Washington calibrates. The United States helps defend, works the phones, shores up deterrence, and resists a spiral that leads to the very folder no one wants to open. So why, across so many administrations, do the folders keep returning to the drawer? Because bombing Iran is not an action. It's a chain reaction. Consider the pieces. First, the geography of the program. It is not a single bunker, and it is not all above ground. Is dispersed and layered. Natanz, Fordow, Isfahan, Iraq, Tehran research sites. Some declared, some suspected, some civilian adjacent, some military. Fordow sits under rock. Natanz can be rebuilt. New facilities can be carved into mountains over time. A strike can destroy machines and buildings, cannot erase expertise. Over decades, analysts return to the same line: the best you can reasonably do with airstrikes is delay. Second, the ladder of escalation. Iran is not Iraq 1981. It has a doctrine built on asymmetry and patience. It can mobilize militias in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Hezbollah's rockets can saturate northern Israel. Missiles can reach U.S. bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE. Cyber teams can move through networks and turn off lights in places that thought themselves safe. The Strait of Hormuz can be harassed with mines and fast boats. Shipping. Insurers spooked. Oil prices spiking in days. Every U.S. president who has sat with these briefings has asked the same chain of questions. What does Iran do in the first week? The first month? The first year? No one has ever provided an answer that is both honest and reassuring. Third, the day after problem. Bombs do not produce stable political arrangements. The United States could hit Iran, and then what? Are additional waves required to keep the program down? How often? At what political cost internationally and domestically? Are ground forces expected to finish a job the air can't? Every president since 2001 has lived through occupations and insurgencies. Appetite for a new one is scarce. Fourth, the coalition question. The United States rarely fights alone when it can avoid it. Legal cover, allied basing, airspace permissions, these are the invisible rails on which operations run. Europe has repeatedly urged negotiations. Russia and China have blocked sharp resolutions at the UN. Gulf partners detest the idea of retaliation raining down on their skylines. A unilateral strike may fracture the very consensus that keeps sanctions effective and inspections possible. When the non-proliferation regime is already stressed, acting outside it carries a long tail of consequence. Fifth, the domestic constraint. War weariness is a real political force. Americans spent 2 decades in the post-9/11 wars. Presidents read polls. Wars are not fought with approval ratings, but leaders know the limits of what citizens will accept. No more endless wars is not just a slogan. It's a permission structure that constrains choices. Sixth, the intelligence caveats. Bombing takes certainty. You need to know where the target is, what it contains, and how hitting it changes the strategic picture. Classified assessments are often confident about physics and less confident about politics. You can model how a bunker buster penetrates rock. You cannot as easily model whether blowing that bunker pushes a regime toward negotiation or pushes it to sprint in fury. Seventh, alternatives that hurt without igniting. Every administration has explored them, and several have used them. Sanctions that limit revenue and access. Export controls that strangle supply chains. Covert operations that quietly sabotage. Cyber tools that disrupt the very nerves of a complex program. Partnerships with Israel and Gulf states to share intelligence, to intercept shipments, to blip out drones in the sky. Defensive networks that lower the payoff of escalation. These are not clean solutions. They are management strategies. But in the hard arithmetic of statecraft, management often beats catastrophe. These are the general truths. The particulars are human. Picture President Reagan's team after Iran Air 655. Recognizing how quickly miscalculation multiplies. Picture President Clinton after Khobar Towers, weighing justice against a war that might scour a region for a generation. Picture President Bush, briefed on EFP's killing. Americans in Iraq, knowing Iran's fingerprints are on the bomb components, choosing to fight the networks rather than strike calm. Picture President Obama, staring at renderings of Fordow drilled into a mountain, seeing wargames cascade to ugly places, deciding that inspectors and cameras will buy more time than craters. Picture President Trump, informed that a strike package is ready, that the missiles can fly in minutes, and hearing a number deaths estimated on the other side of the target line that tilts the scale. Picture President Biden, with headlines popping after a volley of drones, balancing support for allies, with the need to prevent a war that would engulf them all. One of the more honest sentences you will ever hear from a senior official is this: the absence of a strike does not mean nothing happened. In reality, not bombing Iran has meant years of quiet, disciplined work to delay, deter, and deflect work that rarely makes it into speeches. It has meant fragile communications between adversaries to prevent accidents from becoming cycles. It has meant making space for inspectors in a country that doesn't want them, pulling them back when politics turn, pushing for them again when new windows open. It has meant condoning ally actions that advance a shared goal while avoiding ownership that triggers escalation. It has meant long campaigns to integrate air and missile defenses across the region because the best way to avoid bombing is to survive what the other side might launch without having to start a war. And it has meant living with ambiguity. Iran insists its program is peaceful. The IAEA catalogs compliance and violations. Intelligence agencies debate intent versus capability. Hawks warn that time is evaporating. Doves warn that war never returns what it promises. In that haze, presidents choose. Sometimes they choose a deal. Sometimes they choose more pressure. Always they choose not to send bombers to Iranian skies. Not because they cannot, but because the cost of being wrong is higher than the cost of being cautious. There is a counterargument worth hearing. That restraint invites bolder adversaries. That failing to strike today guarantees a worse war tomorrow. It is an argument that has advocates in every era. It carries a kind of hard wisdom born of bitter surprises. But the history of American debate over Iran suggests something else. That it is possible to make an adversary pay without lighting the match. That it is possible to delay a program year after year through export controls, sabotage, and diplomacy. That regimes like people have cycles. That public opinion inside authoritarian states shifts in response to domestic pressures more than external bombs. That the most effective non-proliferation tool is often time. War games, the sober ones, have a way of humbling planners. Over and over, the clock runs, and the pieces move, and the story ends in places no one would choose. A general mobilization, a global recession, a region on fire. The lesson of those games is not that force never works. The U.S. military is a scalpel and a sledgehammer and a shield. It has removed terrorists and deterred attacks and kept allies safe. The lesson is narrower. That bombing Iran, even skillfully, is not a finite act. It is an invitation to the unknown. And presidents, whatever else they are guardians against the unknown. We often treat restraint as the absence of courage. It is not. It is the courage to say that the most dramatic act is not always the most effective one. That sometimes the hardest thing in the world is to sit in a room full of power and choose not to use it. That sometimes the quiet policy sanctions, sabotage, surveillance, negotiation is the one that keeps ships moving through a strait, keeps kids asleep in base housing along a hot coastline, keeps fuel in an economy's veins. Look back over the decades and a pattern comes into view. American presidents have been hawks and pragmatists, idealists and cynics. They have disagreed about deals and doctrine. But in the end, they have all stared at the same map and seen the same trap. A strike that feels good on the first night and terrible on the 10th, the 100th, the 1000th. So they have done something harder. They have kept their hands steady on the table, while the room waits for a decision they will not make. One day, the folder may open and stay open. History is not a closed circuit. But for now, the secret debate is not a mystery. It is a discipline. When you strip the rhetoric away and lay out the facts, the targets that harden with every year, the proxies that stand ready, the strait that narrows to a choke point and a risk, the logic is clear. The United States has refused to bomb Iran not because it lacks the will or the means, but because the cost of doing so has, so far, outweighed the benefit. That is not weakness. It is strategy. In a different room, another map waits, one with timelines instead of targets. It shows years, earned by inspectors and sanctions and the quiet sabotage a computer never complains about, years in which wars did not happen and oil tankers did not burn and air raid sirens did not carve their panic into nights that would not end. No president will give a speech about that map. There is no ribbon cutting for the disaster that did not arrive. But maybe there should be a line we remember anyway, for the next time the folder slides across the table and the room holds its breath. That in statecraft, as in life, restraint is not the Absence of action. It is the choice that keeps the future larger than the explosion you can make today.